Chapter 1. Introduction. King George III and his time. King George III, 1738 to 1820, is one of the best known and, at the same time, most controversial monarchs in British history. His reign, which lasted from 1760 until his death in 1820, was one of the longest in the history of the United Kingdom. It fell into an era of profound upheavals, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. Under his rule, Great Britain developed into a global power, which on the one hand had to accept the loss of its American colonies, but on the other hand was able to expand its position in world trade and in the European balance of power. George III ascended the throne at a time when the monarchy was changing. After the turbulent centuries of the Tudors and Stuarts and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the political system had developed into a constitutional monarchy. Although the king continued to be a central figure, he increasingly shared power and decision-making powers with Parliament and its prime ministers. George III tried to counteract this development and give the crown more weight again. In doing so, he repeatedly encountered conflicts that shaped the political debates of his era. A central point of his reign was the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence of the Colonies in 1776 and the subsequent war until 1783 represented not only a military and political setback for Great Britain, but also a personal defeat for George III. In popular perception, especially in the United States, he became a symbol of monarchical oppression. In Britain itself, however, he retained his popularity despite the defeat, as he was considered a steadfast, albeit stubborn, defender of royal authority. In addition to foreign policy, economic and social developments shaped the time of George III. In the middle of his reign, the Industrial Revolution began, which profoundly changed Great Britain. Cities grew, new industries emerged, trade and colonial policy gained momentum. This was accompanied by social tensions, labor disputes, and a growing need for reforms, which increasingly challenged the political system. The Napoleonic Wars also shaped George's era. Great Britain was at the center of the coalitions against France and played a decisive role in the fight against Napoleon through its naval supremacy and economic strength. Under George III, the Royal Navy became the world's dominant naval power, and the British Empire consolidated its global influence. At the same time, George III is closely linked to his personal tragedy. His mental and physical illnesses, which repeatedly forced him to long retreats, led to the installation of his son as Prince Regent from 1811 onwards. In public, the image of a king emerged who, despite personal weaknesses, tirelessly tried to fulfill his duty. His suffering contributed to his sympathy in Britain, even though his political power was severely limited in the last years of his rule. To sum up, the reign of George III was marked by deep contradictions, a king who sought to preserve the power of the crown while parliamentary government grew stronger, a ruler who had to cope with military defeats like in America, but at the same time laid the foundations for British victories against Napoleon, a man who vacillated between the image of the tyrannical king and the paternal patriot. George III thus forms a key figure in understanding the development of Great Britain from the 18th to the early 19th century, an empire in transition from feudal structures to a modern, industrialized, and globally oriented society. Chapter 2. Childhood and Education of George III. George III was born on 4th June 1738 in the London borough of Norfolk House. He came from the House of Hanover, which had held the British crown since 1714 after the Protestant line of the Stuarts had died out. His grandfather, George II, was King of Great Britain at the time, while his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was intended to be the heir to the throne. George thus grew up in an environment marked by political intrigue, courtly splendor, and the expectation that one day he would play a central role in the monarchy. However, the young prince's childhood was overshadowed by uncertainty. His father Frederick died in 1751 at the age of only 44, when George was just 12 years old. This made George the direct heir to the throne of his grandfather. The early death of his father had a lasting impact on him. He grew up without a paternal orientation, but under the strict influence of his mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, a dutiful and ambitious woman. She gave him the idea that he had a special responsibility to God and his people, and placed great emphasis on moral integrity and discipline. His upbringing was unusually thorough. Unlike many of his predecessors, George spoke English as his mother tongue, which brought him closer to the people compared to his German-born grandfather and great-grandfather. He was extensively taught history, literature, philosophy, mathematics, and science. He was particularly interested in astronomy, botany, and agriculture, topics that he pursued with great zeal throughout his life. Later, he was so well known for his passion for agriculture that he was derisively nicknamed Farmer George, which also reflected his proximity to practical things and his understanding of economic processes. In addition to the classical humanities, George was also trained in the duties of a monarch. These included law, military affairs, and state administration. He received instruction from respected scholars, including theologians, who taught him the principles of Protestantism and moral responsibility. His mother made sure that he developed a strong sense of duty and internalized virtues such as diligence, thrift, and modesty. This clearly distinguished him from other monarchs of his time, who were often conspicuous by pomp and personal excesses. However, his youth was not free of tensions. At the court of his grandfather, George II, conflicts arose between his mother's party and the king's advisors. The young prince was drawn into these intrigues, which made him aware of the power games and uncertainties of political life at an early age. He grew up in an atmosphere where loyalties changed and personal relationships often made the difference between success and failure. These experiences reinforced his caution and need for control, qualities that would later shape his reign. Despite the political tensions, George developed a close bond with his siblings, especially his brother Edward, Duke of York. This family closeness gave him support at a time when he grew up between court etiquette, strict upbringing, and public attention. His training prepared him for the role of king, but it also gave him an ideal image, the monarch as a moral role model, God-fearing ruler, and protector of his people. These principles remained important to George III throughout his life. He did not regard his rule as a personal privilege, but as a divine duty. In summary, the childhood and upbringing of George III shaped a man who was filled with discipline, a sense of duty, and moral seriousness. His proximity to the English language and culture, his scientific interest, and his sense of responsibility distinguished him from his predecessors. At the same time, intrigues and power games at court led him to learn early on to exercise caution and assert authority, qualities that would have a lasting influence on his kingship. Chapter 3. The Ascension to the Throne, 1760. When George III ascended the British throne in 1760, he was just 22 years old. He succeeded his grandfather, George II, after he died in October of the same year. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had died 9 years earlier, so George had been the designated heir to the throne since his youth. The coronation of the young king marked a pivotal moment, not only for the monarchy, but also for British society, which was in a period of profound change. The new king differed significantly from his predecessors. While George I and George II were often perceived as foreigners on the English throne, as Germans with limited language skills and close ties to Hanover, George III was the first king from the House of Hanover to be born in England and raised speaking English. He already explained in his throne speech that he saw himself primarily as a British king and no longer as a foreign ruler. This claim strengthened his popularity as it conveyed closeness to the people and heralded a new era of identification with the monarch. Political expectations of the young king were high. Britain was in the midst of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, a global conflict that pushed the country to its financial and military limits. George III, therefore, not only had to find his role as ruler, but also deal directly with the pressing issues of war, diplomacy, and finance. Already here, an area of tension became apparent that was to accompany his entire reign, the balance between the influence of the king and the increasing power of Parliament. George III took office with the firm intention of strengthening the authority of the crown. His mother had prepared him since childhood for the fact that the king must not only take on a representative, but also an actively shaping role in politics and society. He saw himself as a morally superior ruler who put the welfare of the country above personal interests. However, this attitude quickly led to tensions with prime ministers and parliamentary factions who wanted to limit the monarch's power. A central theme of his early kingship was the election of the prime minister. George III appointed his favorite, the Earl of Bute, in 1762, a man who stood out more for his personal closeness to the king than for his political experience. This decision was met with sharp criticism in Parliament and the public, as many politicians feared that George wanted to disregard the tradition of the constitutional monarchy and return to a more absolutist way of governing. The conflict over Bute revealed early on how difficult the relationship between the Crown and Parliament was to become under George III. Despite these tensions, the beginning of his reign was borne by broad sympathy. The young king was considered dutiful, morally upright, and close to the people. He led a comparatively modest life, was closely associated with his wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, whom he married in 1761, and attached great importance to family life. In contrast to the often dissolute and scandalous lifestyles of some of his predecessors, George conveyed an image of stability and civic virtue that was well received by the population. The coronation itself became a political and cultural event. It was not only intended to mark the beginning of a new reign, but also to strengthen the image of the king as a patriot and moral leader. In speeches, celebrations, and symbolic gestures, George emphasized his commitment to the country and presented himself as a guarantor of unity and continuity. In summary, the ascension of George III to the throne in 1760 was a moment of transition. With him, a new phase of the monarchy began. A king who saw himself as British, wanted to strengthen the authority of the crown, and had to define his role in the midst of war and political uncertainty. The beginning of his reign laid the foundation for the conflicts and challenges that were to characterize his reign, from the dispute with Parliament to the loss of American colonies to the wars against Napoleon. Chapter 4: Early Royalty and Political Challenges. The first years of George III's reign were dominated by the question of what role the king should actually play in a constitutional monarchy of the 18th century. George wanted to be not only a representative, but to actively influence the government and strengthen the authority of the crown vis-à-vis Parliament. In doing so, he bucked a trend that had begun since the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and had increasingly shifted political power towards Parliament and prime ministers. His earliest and most controversial decision was the appointment of his close confidant, John Stuart, Earl of Bute, as prime minister in 1762. Bute was a man without a broad parliamentary base, but he was closely connected to George personally. For the young king, he embodied the ideal of a loyal advisor who represented the interests of the crown. For many parliamentarians, however, Bute was a symbol of royal interference in government affairs. This appointment immediately provoked tensions between the crown and Parliament, which were to accompany George's entire reign. During the Bute's government, the Treaty of Paris was concluded in 1763, ending the 7 Years' War. Although Great Britain emerged victorious and won Canada, Florida, and influence in India, the immense costs of the war had left the country heavily in debt. To offset these burdens, the government raised taxes, not only in Britain itself, but also in the American colonies. This policy sowed the seeds for the later conflicts that would lead to the American Revolution. Bute's unpopularity grew, not least due to harsh criticism in the newspapers, which increasingly became an important political forum in the 18th century. After only 1 year in office, Bute resigned, but the damage to George's reputation was done. Many saw him as a king who tried to circumvent the rules of the constitutional monarchy by placing personal favorites in key positions. After Bute's resignation, a phase of political instability began, in which the prime ministers took turns almost every year. George tried to exert influence by mediating between rival factions or supporting candidates who he believed were loyal to the crown. But Parliament, especially the House of Commons, became increasingly important. This led to a permanent crisis of political authority, which called into question both George's personal ambitions for power and the stability of the government. Another problem was the increasing politicization of the public. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political clubs made politics a public issue that was no longer negotiated only in the halls of Westminster. George III became the target of satirical attacks, caricatures, and critical essays, in which he was often portrayed as stubborn, backward, or authoritarian. Especially in connection with the colonies in America, he was even branded a tyrant in the following years, an image that still has an effect in the United States today. Nevertheless, there were also positive aspects of his early reign. George III showed himself to be a monarch with a strong moral compass who wanted to curb corruption and waste at court. He lived relatively modestly, maintained a harmonious family life with Queen Charlotte, and presented himself as a citizen-oriented king, which earned him sympathy in large parts of the population. This image of the patriot king helped him to maintain a certain popularity despite political crises. To sum up, the early years of George III's reign were marked by political tensions, unstable governments, and the king's attempt to redefine the role of the crown. A power struggle arose between Parliament, the public, and the crown that was to accompany George's entire reign. The conflicts over the king's authority, tax policy, and the question of the balance between monarchy and parliament formed the background for the great challenges that were to follow, above all, the American Revolution. Chapter 5. Foreign Policy and Europe in the 18th Century. Foreign policy under George III was a central field of his rule and reflected Britain's position in the European balance of power. After the 7 Years' War, the country had risen to become the leading world power, with colonies in North America, possessions in India, and a strong naval fleet that could secure its global interests. But this triumph had been bought dearly and brought with it new tensions that determined George's politics in the decades to come. In Europe, the situation after 1763 was characterized by complex dynamics. The great powers, France, Spain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, struggled for influence and territory. Britain had traditionally tried to secure the European balance through alliances without making a permanent commitment to the continent. George III shared this view. His main interest was to secure British maritime supremacy and protect colonial possessions. France remained the main rival. Although France was severely weakened by the 7 Years' War, it tried to regain its position in Europe and overseas. George III and his governments were aware that France continued to pose a threat, not only militarily, but also ideologically. Especially in the 1780s and 1790s, when the French Revolution shook Europe, France became the central adversary against which British foreign policy was directed. Another area of tension was the relationship with Spain. After 1763, Spain was weakened by the loss of Florida, but retained important colonies in Latin America and the Pacific. For Great Britain, securing the sea routes was of crucial importance, and conflicts over trade rights, shipping lanes, and colonial claims repeatedly arose. In Northern Europe, Great Britain sought good relations with Prussia, which played a central role under Frederick the Great. Prussia was considered a potential ally against France and Austria. However, George III was cautious about entering into too narrow commitments, as he still had the experience of the costly continental wars in mind. George also paid special attention to the situation in Ireland. Although Ireland was formally part of the British Crown, religious and political tensions made the island a constant problem area. France's influence on Irish nationalists posed an additional danger, especially at a time when Britain was militarily tied to the continent. In addition to Europe, foreign policy also played a decisive role in the expansion of the British Empire. India became increasingly important, and the East India Company massively expanded its power in Bengal and other regions. George III supported this expansion, even though it repeatedly entailed political and military conflicts. The buildup of British power in Asia laid the foundation for the later empire on which the sun never sets. Overall, George's foreign policy goal was not territorial expansion in Europe, but to secure maritime and colonial supremacy. Britain was to remain the leading trading and naval power, secured by a strong military and skilled diplomacy. However, this strategy also led to tensions with the colonies in America, where the motherland increasingly wanted to assert its interests, a conflict that eventually led to the American Revolution. In summary, it can be said that George III pursued a course of foreign policy aimed at security, stability, and maritime supremacy. Europe remained important, but the real center of British power was overseas. This orientation made Great Britain the leading world power in the long term, but also brought about new conflicts that profoundly changed the empire in the second half of the 18th century. Chapter 6. The 7 Years' Wars and their consequences. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was one of the first real world wars in history and represented a turning point in the development of Great Britain. George III ascended the throne during the conflict, so the early years of his reign were significantly marked by the political, military, and financial consequences of this war. The war had its origins in a global power struggle between Great Britain and France. While the two countries faced each other in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India, other powers were also involved. Prussia fought on the British side against Austria, Russia, and France, while Spain temporarily supported France. The conflict spread to the point that historians often refer to it as the First World War. Great Britain emerged as the clear winner in the end. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the country received Canada from France, Florida from Spain, and confirmed its supremacy in India. This laid the foundation for the British Empire to develop into the leading colonial power. The Royal Navy had impressively demonstrated its strength and finally made Great Britain the dominant naval power. But the victory had its price. The war was extremely costly, and Britain's national debt had risen to record levels. In order to bear the financial burden, the government had to open up new sources of revenue. The focus was on the North American colonies. Until now, they had paid relatively low taxes compared to their economic potential. In London, there was a growing conviction that the colonies had to make a greater contribution, not least because a significant part of the war costs had been spent on their defense. However, this tax policy led to massive tensions. Measures such as the Sugar Act 1764 and the Stamp Act 1765 sparked protests in the colonies. Under the slogan, "No taxation without representation," resistance formed and grew stronger and stronger in the years that followed. For George III, the question of colonial taxes was a central problem of his government. He insisted that the authority of Parliament over the colonies must be respected. This claim led directly to the conflicts that were to escalate into the American Revolution. Domestically, the war also exacerbated tensions. The high debts also led to tax increases in Great Britain itself. At the same time, conflicts arose between the king and parliament over how to control state finances and what role the crown should play in this process. George III tried to assert the authority of royalty by influencing financial policy, a move that earned him the accusation of interfering in the work of Parliament. In addition to the financial consequences, the war also had social and cultural effects. The victory over France strengthened the self-confidence of the British and led to growing national pride. At the same time, Britain's identity as a world power based on maritime strength, colonies, and trade began to emerge. This development was to shape the entire reign of George III and set the framework for the conflicts to come. In summary, the 7 Years' War was both a triumph and a burden for George III. Great Britain had considerably expanded its empire and established itself as the leading maritime power. But the financial costs and the resulting tensions with the American colonies laid the foundation for the greatest crisis of his rule, the loss of the United States. The war thus marked a turning point that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the British monarchy in the 18th century. Chapter 7. The Relationship to the Colonies in North America. During the reign of George III, the relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies developed from a fundamentally loyal relationship to an open conflict that eventually led to the American Revolution. The king played a central role in this, not necessarily as the sole perpetrator, but as a symbol of the authority that London claimed over the colonies. After the victory in the 7 Years' War, Great Britain had significantly expanded its possessions in North America. With Canada and Florida, new territories were under British control, and the previous 13 colonies saw themselves more affected by imperial policy than ever before. The protection of these areas required a permanent military presence, which increased the cost to the motherland. In London, there was a growing conviction that the colonies would have to make a greater financial contribution. This view was expressed in various tax laws.
The Sugar Act, 1764, levied duties on sugar and other imported goods. And the Stamp Act, 1765, introduced a direct tax on printed matter, contracts, and newspapers. For the colonists, this was an affront. They considered themselves subjects of the king, but not directly liable to pay taxes to the Parliament in London, as they had no representatives there. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," summed up this self-image. George III saw the demands of the colonists as a questioning of royal authority. It was clear to him that Parliament had the right to enact laws and taxes for the entire empire. Giving in to the colonies seemed to him to be a weakness that would endanger the authority of the crown and the unity of the empire. That is why he supported the hard line, even if individual prime ministers and parliamentarians tried to find compromises. Tensions escalated in the following years. The Townshend Act, 1767, and the Tea Act, 1773, led to other protests, including the famous Boston Tea Party, in which colonists threw British tea into the harbor basin to protest against taxation. London responded with the so-called coercive acts, or intolerable acts, which placed Massachusetts under direct control and massively restricted public life. George III expressly supported this hard line as he wanted to bring the colonies back to order. In the colonies, however, the feeling grew that they were no longer part of a common empire, but victims of tyrannical politics. In pamphlets and speeches, George III was increasingly portrayed as a tyrant who trampled on the rights of the colonists. The Declaration of Independence of 1776 directed its harshest accusations directly against the king, not against Parliament, a clear sign that George had become a symbol of oppression for the colonists. From the British point of view, however, this was by no means so clear-cut. Many in London saw the colonists as ungrateful, as they benefited from the protection of the British Army but refused to pay a fair share of the costs. George III himself regarded the resistance as a rebellion that had to be crushed by all means. His determination hardened the fronts and made a peaceful settlement increasingly impossible. To sum up, the relationship between George III and the North American colonies was a lesson in different notions of belonging and authority. While the colonists wanted to combine their loyalty to the king with local rights and self-government, George III saw his role as indivisible and Parliament as the legitimate legislator for the entire empire. These irreconcilable positions ultimately led to the war that would change the history of both sides forever.
Chapter 8. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The American Revolution was the decisive conflict in the reign of George III and had a lasting impact on his image in history. For the colonists, he became a symbol of monarchical oppression, but for many Britons, he remained a king who did his duty and defended the integrity of the empire. The War of 1775 to 1783 was not only a military conflict, but also an ideological struggle over the question of how far the power of a king and parliament could extend over distant subjects. The tensions had already been building up for over a decade. After the tax reforms and the repressive measures against Massachusetts, the colonies founded the First Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate their positions. When the first battles broke out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the conflict finally escalated. For George III, it was clear that these were no longer protests, but an open rebellion that had to be answered with military force. In a famous speech to Parliament in 1775, he declared that he was determined to regain the colonies and assert the authority of the crown. This attitude made compromise solutions impossible. When the colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, they directed their harshest accusations directly against the king. George III was portrayed as a tyrant who had disregarded the rights and freedoms of the colonists. In the consciousness of the Americans, he had finally become the main figure of the conflict. Militarily, the war was changeable. First, the British were able to achieve important victories, such as the capture of New York in 1776. But the size of the area, the determination of the colonists, and the difficulty of securing supplies across the Atlantic made the war increasingly costly and difficult.
France's decision to enter the war on the side of the colonists in 1778 dramatically exacerbated the situation. Now Britain was involved in a global conflict that was fought not only in North America, but also in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and India. For George III, the war was not only a political matter, but also a personal one. He saw it as his duty to preserve the unity of the empire and to put down the uprising. This attitude was criticized by many contemporaries as stubbornness, but in his eyes, it was an expression of his sense of duty and his conviction that indulgence would endanger the entire empire. The decisive turning point came in 1781 with the defeat at Yorktown, in which British troops under General Cornwallis had to surrender. In London, the realization grew that the war could no longer be won. George III initially refused to admit defeat and even considered continuing the war. It was only pressure from Parliament and political reality that forced him to initiate peace negotiations. With the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. For the colonists, the war was a victory of freedom over tyranny. For George III, on the other hand, a bitter defeat. In the United States, his name remained associated with oppression and arbitrarity for a long time. In Great Britain, however, he was not seen as the sole culprit. Many regarded him as a king who fulfilled his duty to the end, even if the policies of his ministers and the military circumstances were against him. In summary, the American Revolution was a personal and political turning point for George III. It showed the limits of monarchical power in the age of emerging freedom and independence movements. While the United States established itself as a new republic, Great Britain had to reorient herself, and George III learned that the crown could no longer determine the fate of a global empire without restrictions.
Chapter 9. After the defeat. Great Britain after 1783. The defeat in the American Revolutionary War marked a deep turning point in the history of Great Britain and in the reign of George III. For the first time, the empire had lost a significant part of its colonies, not through external conquest, but through the uprising of former subjects. For many contemporaries, this seemed like a national humiliation. But at the same time, a new phase opened up in which Great Britain redefined its role as a world power, and George III had to learn to deal with the consequences of this crisis. Immediately after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the political atmosphere in London was tense. Parliament was deeply divided. Some blamed the king for insisting on a hard line against the colonies for too long. Others blamed the prime ministers and generals for the military failures. George III himself felt the defeat as a personal blow, but he maintained that he had acted to the best of his knowledge and belief to preserve the unity of the empire. Politically, the crisis led to a realignment of the government. The Prime Minister, Lord North, who had long taken a hard line against the colonies, resigned in 1782. A phase of unstable coalitions followed, in which the young politician William Pitt the Younger rose to the top. Pitt, who became Prime Minister in 1783, became one of the most influential figures in British politics and worked closely with George III. Despite occasional differences, Pitt was a partner for the king who helped restore confidence in the government and the crown. However, the defeat in America did not mean the end of British world power ambitions. Instead, the focus shifted to other parts of the empire. India, in particular, became the focus, where the East India Company massively expanded its power. Expansion in Asia and securing trade routes made it clear that Britain continued to pursue global goals, even though it had suffered defeat in North America. Domestically, the post-war period was marked by economic and social tensions. The war had caused enormous costs, the national debt was high, and many soldiers returned penniless. At the same time, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution gave rise to new social classes. Factory workers, entrepreneurs, and traders increasingly demanded a say and better living conditions. George III and his government had to learn to deal with these changes, while at the same time trying to stabilize the monarchy. For George personally, the period after 1783 also brought a rehabilitation of his image. While it had become a symbol of tyranny in the United States, it gained popularity in Britain.
His simple, middle-class life, his marriage to Queen Charlotte, and his large family had a calming effect in a time of political uncertainty. Many Britons no longer saw him as a rigid ruler, but as a king who fulfilled his duty and remained with personal integrity. A new phase also began culturally. The intellectual debates of the Enlightenment, the development of new scientific knowledge, and the spread of literature and art made the late 18th century a dynamic epoch. George III himself had a great interest in science and promoted libraries, astronomical studies, and agricultural innovations. His passion for knowledge and research contributed to an image that made him appear as a learned king. To sum up, the period after 1783 was a period of reorientation and adaptation for Great Britain. Although the empire had suffered a historic defeat in America, the foundations of its global power remained. Indeed, they shifted more towards Asia and maritime dominance. For George III, the defeat meant a personal setback, but it also opened up the opportunity to present himself as a morally upright, popular, and steadfast figure. This marked the beginning of a second phase of his rule, which was increasingly shaped by domestic political reforms and the challenges of the Industrial Revolution.
Chapter 10: Domestic Politics and Social Order. After the defeat in America, the focus of George III's reign increasingly shifted to domestic politics. The kingdom was in a period of profound change. The first signs of the Industrial Revolution, growing social tensions, and the demand for political reforms presented society with challenges that George III and his governments had to overcome. A central feature of this period was the strengthening of Parliament. Although George had initially tried to make active use of royal authority, after the political crises of the 1760s and 1770s, he increasingly accepted that the monarchy was not capable of governing without the support of Parliament. He worked more closely with prime ministers such as William Pitt the Younger, who exerted great influence on the government from 1783 onwards. This cooperation led to a certain stability, which the country desperately needed. Pitt and George III pursued a policy that stabilized finances on the one hand, but also cautiously promoted reforms on the other. The gigantic mountain of debt from the wars had to be paid off, which was only possible through more efficient tax collection and the promotion of trade. At the same time, it was necessary to curb corruption in Parliament and modernize the administration. Pitt set important accents here, supported by a king who valued thrift and moral integrity. But society was in a state of upheaval. With the Industrial Revolution, cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool grew rapidly. Factories, mines, and new production methods fundamentally changed the world of work. While entrepreneurs and traders benefited from new opportunities, workers often suffered from miserable conditions, long working hours, and a lack of social security. These grievances led to the first workers' protests and unrest, which posed new challenges for George's governments. Nevertheless, the social order remained strongly hierarchical. The nobility continued to dominate political and social life, while the rural population, especially agricultural workers and tenants, lived in poverty. The king himself became popular with many ordinary people due to his simple life and his interest in agriculture, hence the nickname Farmer George, which mocked him on the one hand, but on the other hand made it clear that he was close to the people. Politically, the pressure for reforms of the electoral law grew. The existing system favored small pocket boroughs controlled by wealthy landowners, while large industrial cities were poorly represented. Radical thinkers, inspired by the American Revolution and later the French Revolution, called for more democracy, freedom of expression, and participation. George III was skeptical of these ideas and supported Pitt in his policy of strictly monitoring and partially suppressing radical movements. Another area of tension was the Irish question. Ireland was formally linked to the British crown, but the Catholic minority was politically and religiously disadvantaged. Demands for more rights and autonomy repeatedly led to conflicts that preoccupied George's governments. The king was particularly unyielding here. He rejected far-reaching concessions to Catholics, as he felt obliged by his coronation oath to protect the Anglican Church. This later led to conflicts even with Pitt, who considered relaxing discrimination. Despite all the tensions, George III remained a stable anchor in the eyes of many subjects. His personal lifestyle, dutiful, thrifty, and family-oriented, set him apart from many European rulers who stood out for their pomp, intrigue, or scandal.
Especially at a time when social unrest and political upheavals were increasing, this image of the citizen-oriented king had a calming effect. In summary, domestic politics under George III was characterized by the attempt to maintain stability and order in a time of profound change. Between industrialization, social tensions, demands for reform, and religious conflicts, the king tried to assert his role as a moral role model and protector of the existing order. Although he was reluctant to support reforms, his personal integrity and pragmatism made him a central figure who enjoyed the trust of many Britons.
Chapter 11. George III and the Economy. The reign of George III coincided with a period of profound economic transformations that changed not only the structures of the British Empire, but also the foundations of the modern world economy. Under his rule, the Industrial Revolution began in full, and Britain increasingly developed into the workshop of the world. At the same time, the country had to cope with the enormous financial burdens of the wars, which had driven the national debt to unimagined heights. A central problem after the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War was government financing. The wars had devoured billions, and the burden of debt threatened to crush the country economically. Under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, a comprehensive reform program was launched to consolidate finances. New taxes, stricter collection, and more efficient administration were supposed to secure the state's revenues. George III supported this policy, as he personally stood for thrift and budgetary discipline. At the same time, Great Britain experienced an enormous upswing in trade. After the loss of the American colonies, the focus shifted to other regions: India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. The East India Company continued to expand its power and secured Britain access to valuable raw materials such as cotton, tea, and spices. The Caribbean remained important for sugar production and slavery, while the African coast remained part of the transatlantic triangular trade that connected goods, slaves, and raw materials. The Industrial Revolution changed the country from the ground up. New inventions, such as James Watt's steam engine, mechanical looms, and advances in iron processing led to explosive growth in production. Factories were established, first in the textile sector, soon also in metalworking and mechanical engineering. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds grew rapidly and developed into centers of the new industrial society. However, economic growth was also accompanied by social problems. Factory work meant long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. Child labor was widespread, and the rapidly growing cities often had catastrophic hygienic conditions. George III himself intervened in these problems only indirectly, as social reforms were not yet the focus of politics at that time. But his personal attitude, sense of duty, moral integrity, and proximity to agriculture led to him being perceived as a symbol of a down-to-earth and just order. Agriculture also remained of central importance during his reign. George was personally interested in agricultural innovations and supported the spread of new methods such as crop rotation, the use of modern equipment, and the breeding of higher-yielding livestock. His nickname, Farmer George, reflected this passion. Even though he was occasionally ridiculed by the elite, this proximity to agriculture made him popular with many ordinary people. Another important aspect was the role of financial markets. During this time, London developed into the leading center of international credit and capital movements. The Bank of England played an increasingly important role in stabilizing government finances, and trading in stocks and bonds increased. This created the foundations that were to make Great Britain the leading economic power in the 19th century. In summary, it can be said that the economy under George III was characterized by an area of tension between burden and new beginnings. On the one hand, enormous war debts put pressure on the state treasury, and on the other hand, the Industrial Revolution created a dynamic that profoundly changed the country and strengthened it in the long term. While George III himself was not an economic politician in the modern sense, his commitment to agriculture, his support for Pitt, and his moral integrity made him a figure associated with economic stability and progress. Chapter 12. The relationship to the Irish question. The relationship between Great Britain and Ireland was a permanent problem throughout the reign of George III.
which repeatedly shook the political stability of the kingdom. Although Ireland had been formally under English control since the 12th century, the relationship was marked by deep tensions. Religious conflicts, social inequalities, and the demand for political autonomy dominated the debates. Under George III, these tensions took on a new quality, as Ireland was influenced by the European wars as well as by the ideas of the Enlightenment and Revolution. Ireland was predominantly Catholic at the time, while political and economic power rested with the Protestant minority, which was closely linked to the English crown. The so-called penal laws severely restricted the rights of Catholics. They were not allowed to hold political office or own land on a large scale. For George III, who had committed himself at his coronation to protect the Anglican Church, the maintenance of this order was a central concern. He saw it as part of his duty to secure the supremacy of the Protestants in Ireland, and thus also to preserve the unity of the crown. During the American War of Independence, many Irish people took the opportunity to raise their own demands for greater self-determination. The so-called Irish Volunteers, a paramilitary organization originally set up to defend against a possible French invasion, pushed for political reform. In 1782, they achieved a major change. The Irish Parliament gained more independence from London, although it remained dominated by Protestant elites. This reform, known as the Constitution of 1782, was a milestone, but did not create real equality for the Catholic majority. The French Revolution and the European wars that followed had an enormous impact on Ireland. Revolutionary ideas were very popular among the Catholic population, and the oppression by the Protestant elite led to growing unrest. In 1791, the United Irishmen movement was born, which, inspired by the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, sought to unite Catholics and Protestants against English domination. George III and his government viewed this movement with great concern, as it not only posed a threat to British rule in Ireland, but was also allied with France. In 1798, the Great Irish Rebellion finally occurred, organized by the United Irishmen and fueled by French support. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, with tens of thousands losing their lives. For George III, this was proof that the Irish question could not be solved by reforms alone, but only by strict control. However, the uprising left deep scars and strengthened the conviction that a structural solution to the relationship between Ireland and Great Britain was necessary. This solution came in the form of the Act of Union of 1801, which formally incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. George III supported the union because it consolidated the unity of the empire and offered the opportunity to bring Ireland more under the control of Parliament in London. However, the question of Catholic emancipation met with massive resistance from the king. Prime Minister Pitt the Younger wanted to grant political rights to Catholics in order to stabilize the union. However, George III strictly rejected this. He saw it as a breach of his coronation oath to defend the Anglican Church. This conflict even led to Pitt's resignation in 1801. In summary, the Irish question was a complex field of tension between religion, politics, and national identity for George III. On the one hand, he recognized the need to integrate Ireland more closely into the empire. On the other hand, he held on to the supremacy of the Anglican Church and refused to make far-reaching concessions to the Catholic majority. In doing so, he postponed the problem into the future without solving it, a burden that his successors also had to bear. Chapter 13. Religion and Church under George III. Religion played a central role in the life and reign of George III. He saw himself as a deeply religious Protestant and saw it as his highest duty to protect and promote the Anglican Church. His faith shaped not only his personal life, but also many of his political decisions, especially in questions of religious tolerance and so-called Catholic emancipation. The Anglican Church was the backbone of the British state in the 18th century. As the state church, it was closely linked to the crown, and the king was considered its supreme secular head. George III took this role very seriously. He saw the church not only as a religious institution, but also as the moral foundation of society. He himself lived an extremely devout life, regularly took part in church services, and promoted church projects. His piety and personal integrity set him apart from many other monarchs who were often criticized for luxury or moral excess. An important area of tension was the relationship with the Catholic subjects, especially in Ireland. As already mentioned, George III was extremely skeptical about Catholic emancipation. His stance was based on the coronation oath, in which he swore to defend the Anglican Church. For him, this was a sacred obligation that left no political room for maneuver. Even though Prime Minister Pitt the Younger proposed reforms in the 1790s that would give Catholics more rights, George blocked these plans. He feared that a weakening of Anglican supremacy would endanger the unity of the kingdom and provoke God's wrath. His negative attitude made him a symbol of oppression for many Catholics. On the other hand, he was revered by conservative Protestants as a staunch defender of the faith. This religious attitude was a double-edged sword. It secured him support from many of his subjects, but at the same time exacerbated tensions with Ireland and the Catholic populations. In addition to the Catholic question, George also had to deal with the nonconformists, Protestant groups such as Baptists, Methodists, or Quakers who stood outside the Anglican Church. Although these groups grew in the 18th century and gained increasing social influence, George regarded them with suspicion. Although he was less strict than towards the Catholics, he was reluctant to grant far-reaching tolerance. Only gradually did nonconformists receive greater rights, but always within the limits allowed by George's religious sense of duty. The church was not only a religious institution, but also an important instrument of social control. Pastors preached loyalty to the king, conveyed moral values, and strengthened awareness of the unity of the crown and the church. George III actively supported this role. He promoted church schools, missions, and charitable projects that were intended to ensure stability, especially in poor neighborhoods and in the countryside. In a time of growing social tensions, the church was thus also a political tool that secured the existing order. Personally, George III led a life marked by strict morality. He was a faithful husband, maintained a close family life, and renounced the debauchery that many other monarchs were said to have. This attitude gave additional weight to his religious authority. Many subjects regarded him as a model of virtue and piety, a Christian king in the true sense of the word. In summary, it can be said that George III understood religion not only as a private faith, but as the central basis of his rule. His deep attachment to the Anglican Church determined his politics, his attitude towards Catholics and nonconformists, and his personal life. On the one hand, he consolidated the image of the pious ruler with moral integrity, and on the other hand, he exacerbated religious conflicts that would occupy the kingdom for a long time to come.
Chapter 14. George III and Culture. The reign of George III coincided with an era in which the cultural life of Great Britain was unfolding in many respects. Art, literature, architecture, and science experienced a significant boom, and although George was not remembered as a spendthrift patron like Louis XIV in France, he was an important patron of culture. His personal interest in science, architecture, and art, as well as his moral stance, shaped the cultural landscape of his era. George III was an educated and curious person by nature. Even as a young prince, he had been enthusiastic about astronomy, botany, and agriculture, and this passion for knowledge accompanied him throughout his life. He created an extensive library, which was one of the largest private collections of its time and later formed the basis for the British Library. His love of books and knowledge earned him the reputation of a learned king. In architecture, George supported projects that had a lasting impact on London's image. Under his rule, important buildings such as the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and extensions to Buckingham House, which was later expanded into Buckingham Palace, were built. Unlike some of his predecessors, George did not tend to be excessively ostentatious, but preferred simple, elegant, and functional architecture that was in line with his personal moral standards. He also showed interest in the visual arts, and in 1768 he promoted the founding of the Royal Academy of Arts, which became a central institution in the British art world. Artists such as Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Academy, or Thomas Gainsborough became formative figures of this era. George's support helped to make British painting and sculpture internationally competitive.
In literature, Great Britain experienced a heyday under George III. Writers such as Samuel Johnson, James Boswell, and Lawrence Sterne shaped the literature of the 18th century. Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language was a milestone in the standardization of the English language. George himself was an avid reader and appreciated literary works, even if he was less active as a patron. George's influence was particularly strong in science. His passion for astronomy led him to maintain close contacts with important scientists of his time, including William Herschel, who discovered the planet Uranus in 1781. George financed Herschel's research and thus promoted decisive advances in astronomy. He also supported the natural sciences and agriculture. He promoted agricultural innovations, new plant techniques, and the breeding of higher-yielding livestock. Music also played a major role at the court of George III. Composers such as George Friedrich Handel, whose works continued to be highly esteemed even after his death in 1759, shaped musical life. George and Queen Charlotte also supported contemporary musicians, such as Johann Christian Bach, the London Bach, who worked as a music teacher for their children. Culturally, the era of George III was also shaped by the Enlightenment. Philosophical debates on freedom, tolerance, human rights, and political order found a wide audience in Great Britain. Authors such as Edmund Burke and Mary Wollstonecraft shaped the intellectual landscape with writings that renegotiated questions of society, politics, and gender roles. George himself was skeptical of such radical ideas, but the intellectual vibrancy of the time helped Britain become a center of the Enlightenment. In summary, George III was not a monarch who dominated culture through ostentatious court, but a king who left a lasting influence through his personal education, interest, and promotion. His support for libraries, scientists, artists, and architects made a decisive contribution to the cultural development of Great Britain. In doing so, he consolidated the image of the citizen-oriented, educated king who did not use culture for self-expression but understood it as a means of promoting knowledge and the common good. Chapter 15. Personal Life and Family. In his private life, George III differed greatly from many other monarchs of his time. While numerous princes of Europe attracted attention through affairs, scandals, or excessive luxury, he led a comparatively modest and virtuous life. This attitude made him popular with many of his subjects who viewed him as a morally upright king, someone who not only ruled but also wanted to be a role model. In 1761, shortly after taking office, George married the German princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The marriage was arranged, as was customary in the European high nobility, but it developed into an extraordinarily stable and harmonious union. Unlike many other rulers of the time, George had no mistresses and was loyal to his wife. Together, they had 15 children, 9 of whom were sons and 6 daughters. The large family contributed to the image of a royal household that at the same time embodied bourgeois values such as loyalty, modesty, and cohesion. Family life at court was characterized by discipline, education, and a certain simplicity. Queen Charlotte shared George's interests in music, art, and science. Together, they promoted cultural projects and attached importance to their children receiving a solid education. Her promotion of music became particularly well known. Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, taught the royal children, and composers such as Haydn also found support at the court for a time. However, the relationship with his children was not free of tensions. While George himself applied strict moral standards, many of his sons developed a rebellious behavior that disappointed him deeply. Especially the later George IV, his eldest son and heir to the throne, led a dissolute life full of affairs, debts, and scandals. This led to repeated conflicts between father and son, which grew into one of the dynasty's defining family dramas. George III was deeply concerned about his heir's behavior, fearing that it would undermine the moral standing of the monarchy. The daughters of George III also played a special role. Unlike many European princesses, they were not married off early, but lived for a long time in a close family unit. This corresponded to George's desire for cohesion, but also led to some of his daughters leading a rather restricted life. It was only late, and only a few of them entered into marriages with foreign or British aristocrats. Personally, George III was considered dutiful, pious, and down-to-earth. He renounced excessive luxury and preferred a simpler life, for example at the Windsor estate, where he engaged in agriculture. His nickname, Farmer George, was meant mockingly, but it also became an expression of his closeness to the people. Many Britons saw in him a king who was not aloof, but in a way, one of them. His deep religiosity and moral principles shaped not only his public life, but also his private life. He had a marriage with Queen Charlotte that was based on mutual respect and shared values. This image of the royal couple, which stood in contrast to many scandalous rulers, gave the monarchy stability in a time of political and social upheaval. However, family life was also overshadowed by worries. George's recurring health problems, especially his mental illnesses, weighed heavily on the family. Queen Charlotte and the children had to witness how he suffered phases of mental derangement that made him temporarily unfit for government. These crises represented not only a private but also a political burden, as the question of a regency came up again and again. In summary, it can be said that George III led a family-oriented, morally stable life that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. His marriage to Charlotte was stable, his children numerous, even if the relationship with them was often overshadowed by conflicts. His private life reinforced the image of a king who did not stand out for his splendor and scandals, but for his virtue, down-to-earthness, and a strong sense of duty. In doing so, he shaped the monarchy in a way that made it approachable and credible for many subjects.
Chapter 16. George III and Napoleon. The second half of George III's reign was decisively marked by the rise and wars of Napoleon Bonaparte. While the Revolution of 1789 swept away the monarchical system in France, Great Britain under George III developed into a staunch opponent of this new order. When Napoleon finally crowned himself emperor, it was clear that the conflict between revolutionary or Napoleonic France and monarchical Britain would become one of the defining battles of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Initially, however, it was the French Revolution that deeply worried George III. He viewed the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 with horror and saw it not only as a political crime, but also as an attack on the God-given principle of monarchy. For George, the revolution was a dangerous example that could also be copied in Great Britain. Therefore, he supported Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger in his policy of strictly monitoring and partially suppressing revolutionary currents in his own country. When France reorganized itself after the Revolutionary Wars under Napoleon and finally rose to become a major military power from 1799 onwards, the situation worsened. George III was determined to position Britain as a bulwark against France. The Royal Navy played a key role in this. Under Admiral Horatio Nelson, it won a decisive victory at Trafalgar in 1805, which secured British naval supremacy for decades. This triumph was celebrated in Britain as a national highlight and strengthened George's reputation as a king who steadfastly resisted Napoleon. On the European continent, the situation was less favorable. France dominated large parts of Europe, and the British allies, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, suffered several heavy defeats. For George III, this was a time of constant tension. He knew that while Britain was in control of the seas, it was unable to defeat Napoleon on land alone. Therefore, his strategy was to weaken France economically while expanding British power in the colonies and on the oceans. A decisive factor was the British attitude to trade. Napoleon tried to isolate Britain economically with the so-called Continental Blockade from 1806 by prohibiting European countries from importing British goods. But instead of ruining Britain, the blockade led to significant economic problems on the continent, while British traders opened up new markets overseas. For George III, this was proof that the empire was resilient due to its maritime strength. The Napoleonic Wars also shaped society domestically. The high costs of the war led to new taxes and a burden on the population. But at the same time, the sense of national solidarity grew. George, who was increasingly struggling with health problems during this time, was nevertheless perceived as a symbol of resistance. His person embodied the stability of the monarchy at a time when almost all of Europe had fallen under Napoleonic rule.
The climax finally came in 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo after his return from Elba. Although George III did not live to see this victory consciously, he was no longer fit to govern at that time due to his illness, his name remained associated with the long struggle against Napoleon. For many contemporaries, he was the king under whose rule Great Britain had survived the greatest threat of his time and asserted itself as the leading world power. In summary, George III was less a military strategist in the fight against Napoleon than a symbol of constancy and resistance. While prime ministers, generals, and admirals made the practical decisions, the king embodied the moral legitimacy of the war. He saw himself as a defender of the monarchy against revolutionary and imperial threats, a role he filled until the end of his reign, even though his personal health increasingly limited him.
Chapter 17. George III and the British Empire. The reign of George III marked a decisive phase in the development of the British Empire. While on the one hand, a deep wound was inflicted with the loss of the American colonies, on the other hand, Great Britain began to rise to become the dominant world power, supported by naval power, trade, and territorial expansion in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. George III himself was not a classic imperial king in the sense of a conqueror, but his reign coincided with the time when the empire redefined its character and took on a global dimension. After the defeat in the American War of Independence, 1783, one might have expected that the British Empire would be on the defensive. Instead, it shifted its focus. While North America was lost, a new perspective opened up in India. The East India Company had had trading bases and influence there for decades, but in the second half of the 18th century, it increasingly turned into a political and military power. The victory at the Battle of Plassey, 1757, had laid the foundation stone, and under George III, the phase began in which Great Britain no longer regarded India only as a trading center, but as the crown jewel of the empire. However, the expansion in India brought not only wealth but also problems. Corruption, exploitation, and mismanagement within the East India Company led to scandals that caused outrage in London. George III supported reforms that increased the influence of Parliament on the company's business. The India Act of 1784, introduced by Prime Minister William Pitt, ensured that the government had direct influence over the administration of India. This was the beginning of the development that finally firmly integrated India into the British Empire. In addition to India, the Caribbean also played a central role. The sugar islands, such as Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, were of enormous economic value, as they supplied the European market with sugar, rum, and other goods. But this economic was based almost entirely on slave labor. The transatlantic slave trade reached its peak during the reign of George III. African slaves were abducted on a large scale to America to work on plantations. At the same time, criticism of slavery grew in the late 18th century. Movements such as the Quakers or personalities such as William Wilberforce campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade. George III himself was rather passive on this issue. Although he was not personally known as a staunch supporter of slavery, he did not actively lead the abolitionists either. The decisive legal change, the prohibition of the slave trade in 1807, nevertheless took place during his reign, even though his health was already severely limited at that time. Another important field was expansion in the Pacific. Expeditions such as those of James Cook in the 1770s opened up new territories such as Australia and New Zealand for the British Empire. The discovery and later settlement of Australia as a convict colony after 1788 was a direct result of the search for new territories after the loss of America. This expansion opened up new horizons for the empire and laid the foundation for Britain's dominance in the Pacific region in the 19th century. The influence of the empire also increased in Africa. In addition to the slave trade, the first colonies were established, such as Sierra Leone, which was founded as a settlement for freed slaves. These early attempts showed that Britain was increasingly beginning to gain a foothold in Africa, a process that was to be intensified in the 19th century. In summary, under George III, the British Empire went through a phase of change and reorientation. North America was lost, but at the same time,
India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific became new focal points. The empire became less of a network of settlement colonies and more of a global empire of trade and power. George III himself was not a conqueror, but his long reign coincided with the decisive phase in which Great Britain laid the foundations for his later supremacy in the 19th century.
Chapter 18: Diseases and Madness. As much as George III stood for a sense of duty, virtue, and stability, his reign was also marked by a tragic dimension: recurring health problems, especially his mental illnesses. In the last years of his reign, they made him increasingly incapable of acting, and finally led to his son taking over the official duties as Prince Regent. George III's illness is one of the most discussed aspects of his biography and had a lasting impact on the image of the king. The first signs of mental confusion appeared as early as the 1760s, but in the 1780s they became clear for the first time. In 1788, George experienced a serious crisis. He spoke incoherently, talked incessantly, suffered from insomnia, and showed paranoid traits. Contemporaries reported that he had given confused speeches for hours and was hardly able to distinguish between reality and imagination. This was a shock to the public, as the king had been considered the epitome of reason and stability until then. The crisis of 1788 led to a political regency debate. Many in Parliament saw the need to install the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, as Prince Regent. However, George III surprisingly recovered and was able to continue his reign. Nevertheless, it was clear that the monarchy had become vulnerable due to the king's illness. The exact cause of his illnesses is still disputed today. Contemporary doctors diagnosed him as insane, but modern research has developed various hypotheses. For a long time, the theory was that George suffered from a metabolic disease called porphyria, which can cause both physical and psychological symptoms. However, recent studies suggest that it may have been more likely to have been bipolar disorder or another form of mental illness. The only thing that is certain is that his illness progressed in episodes, with phases of relative normality and periods of severe mental derangement. In addition to his mental problems, George also suffered from physical illnesses. He had bad eyes, suffered from rheumatism, and in later years from increasing deafness. These ailments increased his isolation and made it difficult for him to carry out his official duties to the fullest. For his family, the relapses of the disease were an enormous burden. Queen Charlotte was desperate about her husband's condition, and the children also suffered from seeing their father in a state of mental derangement. At the same time, the illness exacerbated the tensions between George and his eldest son, who was only too willing to take on the role of regent. In the last years of his life, George's condition deteriorated dramatically. From 1810, he was permanently incapable of governing. After the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, in the same year, he suffered a breakdown from which he never recovered. He was shielded in Windsor Castle and lived there for the last 10 years of his life in almost complete darkness, blind, deaf, and mentally disturbed. The affairs of government passed to his son, who was officially installed as Prince Regent in 1811 and ascended the throne as George IV in 1820 after the death of his father. George III himself remained nominally king, but in fact he was already a living legend, a ruler marked by illness and whose fate evoked sympathy and grief. In summary, the illness of George III was a tragic turn in an otherwise dutiful and long reign. It showed the vulnerability of the monarchy at a time when political stability went beyond the personal fate of an individual. At the same time, it gave his character a human dimension. The king who went mad remains a symbol of the combination of power, duty, and human fragility. Chapter 19: The End of His Reign. The last years of George III's reign were marked by personal suffering, political invisibility, and a gradual withdrawal from the public eye. After decades in which he had been considered a symbol of duty and constancy despite many challenges, his reign ended in a state of complete seclusion. From 1810 onwards, George III was no longer able to perform his duties as king. The death of his favorite daughter Amelia, who was seriously ill and died at the age of only 27, plunged him into a deep crisis. Contemporaries reported that this loss destroyed his already fragile mental balance.
In the months that followed, his mental state deteriorated so much that he was neither fit to govern nor to participate in public appearances. The Parliament then decided to establish a regency. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, took office as Prince Regent in 1811. This marked the beginning of the so-called Regency era, which lasted until 1820. George III formally remained king, but in fact power was now in the hands of his son, who later ascended the throne as George IV. While the world outside was shaken by the Napoleonic Wars, George spent his last years in almost complete isolation. He lived at Windsor Castle, where he was kept strictly shielded from the public. Blindness, deafness, and mental derangement made him a shadow of his former self. The former energy with which he had been enthusiastic about agriculture, science, and politics had disappeared. Visitors reported that he often walked around aimlessly, spoke incoherently, and was hardly able to consciously perceive his surroundings. The public reacted to this fate with a mixture of pity and respect. Many Britons saw in him a tragic king who had dedicated his life to duty but had been defeated by illness. Political business continued, and the monarchy remained in place, a sign that the institution was no longer solely dependent on the person of the king, but was more embedded in the structures of government and parliament. In 1814, when Napoleon was overthrown for the first time, and in 1815, when he was finally defeated at Waterloo, George III could no longer consciously experience these triumphs. Nevertheless, he was remembered as the king under whose rule Great Britain withstood the great threat of the French Revolution and Napoleon. His name remained associated with this era, even though he himself was no longer able to make an active contribution in recent years. On 29 January 1820, George III died at Windsor Castle at the age of 81. This ended the longest reign of a British monarch up to that point. He had sat on the throne for almost 60 years. His death marked the end of an era marked by far-reaching political, social, and economic changes. In summary, the end of George III's reign was marked by personal tragedy. The once dutiful, morally upright king experienced his last years as a broken man cut off from the world. But it was precisely this faith that reinforced the image of a monarch who, despite personal weaknesses and illnesses, was remembered as a symbol of constancy and loyalty. His reign did not end with a dramatic fall, but with a quiet retreat that made the human behind the crown visible.
Chapter 20. Legacy of George III. The death of George III in January 1820 marked the end of one of the longest and most contradictory reigns in British history. He had held the throne for almost 6 decades, longer than any of his predecessors. His life and reign spanned an era in which Great Britain developed from a country under the influence of the Enlightenment and early industrialization to an emerging world power. The legacy of this king is multi-layered. It includes triumphs and defeats, stability and illness, progress and tragedy. A first important point of his legacy concerns the American colonies. For the United States, George III became a symbol of oppression and tyranny. In the Declaration of Independence of 1776, he is portrayed as the main person responsible for the abuses in the colonies. This image shaped the American understanding of history for generations. But from a British perspective, George was not a tyrant, but a king who saw his duty to preserve the unity of the empire. While the loss of America was a major blow, it also forced Britain to realign its imperial strategy with long-term success. While America was lost, the importance of other regions grew. India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific became the new pillars of the British Empire. George III was the monarch under whose reign these courses were set. He himself was not an imperial visionary, but he supported reforms that modernized the administration of the empire and enabled expansion. In doing so, he laid the foundation for the British Empire of the 19th century. A second element of his legacy is his role in domestic politics. George III took office at a time when the power of the crown was even greater, and he initially tried to maintain it. But in the course of his rule, the balance shifted more and more towards Parliament and Prime Minister. The long collaboration with William Pitt the Younger consolidated a system in which the monarchy continued to have symbolic and moral authority, but the practical power of government increasingly lay with Parliament. Thus, George III was a king under whom the constitutional monarchy continued to mature.
George III was particularly remembered as a symbol of moral integrity. His simple, dutiful life, his loyalty to Queen Charlotte, and his passion for science and agriculture distinguished him from many ostentatious and scandalous rulers of Europe. In a time of social change, he embodied consistency, decency, and closeness to the people. His nickname, Farmer George, originally meant mockingly, thus became an expression of appreciation. But his legacy is inextricably linked to his illness. The images of the Mad King shaped not only the perception of his person, but also the understanding of the vulnerability of monarchical power. His last years, marked by blindness, deafness, and mental derangement, made him a tragic figure, a king who had to give up the reality of the government while world history rolled over him. At the same time, he remained an object of pity and affection for many subjects. His suffering made him human, his sense of duty exemplary despite illness. The fact that the monarchy did not disintegrate during this time, but on the contrary emerged stronger from the crisis, is also part of his legacy. After all, George III is remembered as a king who witnessed the transformation of Great Britain, from the loss of America to its rise to industrial power to resistance to the French Revolution and Napoleon. He stood for continuity in an era of upheaval. In summary, it can be said that George III was not a brilliant conqueror and not a charismatic ruler in the classical sense. But he was a king who had a lasting influence on the development of Great Britain through his moral attitude, his sense of duty, and his long reign. His legacy is that of a tragic but steadfast monarch whose life made the tensions between tradition and authority, authority and parliament, disease and duty visible as if in a magnifying glass.